Good morning. So we're going to be doing our next lesson in math, and it is in probability, organizing outcomes. So if you take a look at the you will be able to's, you're going to be able to identify an independent event, and we'll talk about what an independent event is in a little bit. You're going to determine the outcomes of two independent events. And you're also going to be able to organize the outcomes using a table and a tree diagram. So the key things there are that we're going to be going through a couple scenarios, and there's two ways to represent it: table and tree diagram. So those are the two skills we're going to learn today. So a couple of key words here, guys. Independent event. What is an independent event? It is the outcome of one event that has no effect on the outcome of another event. So that means I'm doing two separate things. So let's say I roll a dice and I flip a coin. Those are two independent things. When I flip the coin, it has no effect on me rolling the dice. That's basically what they're trying to explain here when they say independent. Sample space, that's all possible outcomes of an experiment. So you're going to be recording the sample space, and you'll see that in just a second. And finally, we have a tree diagram. So a tree diagram is a diagram that's used to organize outcomes, and we're going to use different branches, which is why it's called a tree diagram, for each possible outcome of an event. All right. So representing outcomes with a table. Here's an example of a question very similar to what I just talked about. We have a coin that's flipped and a six-sided die is rolled. These are two what we call independent events. The reason that they're independent is because they're not related. When I flip this coin, it has no effect on me rolling this dice, on what number is going to come up. If I flip a heads, that doesn't mean I'm going to get a 6 when I roll the dice. Both are completely independent. I might get a heads and I might get a 4. I might get a tails and I might get a 2. So they're both completely independent. They're not reliant on each other. So here's what they're asking you to do. Use a table to list all the possible outcomes. So here we're going to be looking at a table. How many possible outcomes are there? And write the sample space. So we're going to go through this together, and this will make a little bit more sense when you see an example. So represent outcomes with a table. So you'll notice here that it doesn't really matter which one you put where, but I have the die, which is just a singular dice, only one, the die here, and the coin flip here. So I know when I roll the dice, or the die, I could get a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or 6. When I flip the coin, I can only get heads or tails. So the die actually has 6 possible outcomes, and the coin has 2 possible outcomes. And when we say outcomes, we just mean what could happen, right? We see there's 6 different things that could happen for the die when I roll it, but only 2 for the coin. So all they've done here is they're writing out the possible outcomes. So when I flip the coin, if I get heads, I could get a heads and I could get a 1 on the die. Heads, 2 on the die. Heads, 3 on the die, and so on all the way up to 6, only because there's only 6 on the die. The next opportunity is I could get tails and a 1, tails and a 2, tails and a 3, and so on all the way to there. So this part's fairly simple. All you have to do is basically combine the two outcomes. So what we're saying is when I roll the die, I could get a 1 and I can get a heads. You're kind of just doing them this way. A 2 and a heads, 3 and heads, 4 and heads. And then you do the same thing for tails. So, taking a look at this table, how many outcomes are there? Well, we can count. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. So there's 12 possible outcomes when I roll a die and flip a coin. The last question says, write the sample space. Now this part, I'm going to be honest, guys, it's a little bit tedious, but you do have to do it. It is important. So the sample space is when you list all the possible outcomes. And we list them this way. We put the two outcomes together. So see, we have heads and a 1, just like what we had right here. And they go in between brackets. And we use a comma to separate the different outcomes. So see, we have, I'll make it a little bigger, heads, 1, heads, 2. Like I said, this part seems a little bit tedious and like it takes a long time, but in order to get full marks, you have to list out all of these options, okay? So that's important. And especially when you are writing them down, don't forget to put in the brackets on either side and the comma in between, plus a comma between the two different outcomes. So let me just clean that up a little bit. All right. So now there's a you try. Encourage you to pause the video and try it yourself and then come back. Okay, so now hopefully you gave that a try and we're going to go through it together. So it says, a toonie is flipped. Oopsies. A toonie's flipped and a 4-sided die is rolled. Lists all the possible outcomes. So notice in this case, it's not quite set up like a table, but if it was, I have my heads and tails over here, and then I would have my numbers at the top here for the die. So possible outcomes, the first one is gonna be heads, 1. I can get a heads and a 1 on the die. I can get a heads and a 2. Heads, 3. Heads, 4. I can get tails, 1. Tails, 2. Tails, 3. Tails, 4. Next step, how many possible outcomes are there? Well, I count them up. I have 8 possible outcomes. Now, next step is to write the sample space for this. So if you take a look above here, we've got an example of a sample space, so you could just use that to help you write it down. Don't forget those brackets and commas. So heads, 1, heads, 2, heads, 3, heads, 4, and so on. I'm probably going to run out of space here, but hopefully you have a little more space on yours. Tails, 2, tails, 3, tails, 4, and that's it. So I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 listed, and that would be how you would get full marks. Awesome. Great job, you guys. We're going to go on to the next question, which is going to look at tree diagrams. If you have any more questions or you're not sure about tables, I encourage you to go back and look at the examples again. The next slide says representing outcomes with a tree diagram. Now, we talked about earlier a tree diagram and how it has different branches. You're about to see what I mean by that. It's just a different way to represent the data. So you're going to have to know both ways. So here we have a coin that's flipped and a spinner that's spun. What types of events are these? These are independent events. Why are they independent? Because when I flip this coin or spin this spinner, it doesn't affect the other one. They're not connected. They're two separate things. So they want us to create a tree diagram and also list the sample space. Sample space, you know, tree diagram is going to be new. So pay attention for that. Here we go. Represent outcomes with a tree diagram. So it says create a tree diagram that shows all the possible outcomes. So here we have a tree diagram, okay? Notice here we have the coin flip. And the two options when I flip the coin are heads and tails. So notice that this branch splits only into 2, because when we flip a coin, there's only 2 options. Next, when I flip a heads, I can get one of these 3 things on the spinner: bear, salmon, or elk. So there's actually 3 things that could happen. So I make 3 branches, and then I have bear, elk, and salmon. Now, when I flip tails, I can also get bear, elk, and salmon. So that is how you make a tree diagram. It actually doesn't matter if you choose to put the coin flip or the spinner first. Either would be fine. Typically what we do is we try and choose the event that has the least number of outcomes. So this one only has 2, so that's why we put this one first. And then we can branch off into the other ones, because sometimes you might have 5 or 6 here or 7 here. So that's why it's easier to start with the one that has the least amount. In this case, the coin, because it only has 2. Now take a look over here on the outcome section. It says we could have heads bear, heads elk, heads salmon, tails bear, tails elk, tails salmon. Notice that they've just abbreviated to make it a little bit less writing. They've done H for heads and T for tails. That's totally fine, as long as it's clear what you're talking about. So taking a look at this information right here, reading tree diagrams. It says read tree diagrams from left to right. So that's what we did. We started here and we went this way. The branches on the left of the tree show the outcomes for the coin flip. The branches on the right show the outcomes for the spinner. The column on the far right lists the combined outcomes. So technically that's how we figure out our sample space. So now let's do that. Let's do our sample space from this tree diagram. The sample space for these two events is heads bear. So that's the one from here. Oops. Heads bear, heads elk, heads salmon. So the last ones would be T, bear. Notice that I have my brackets and my commas. T, elk, and T, salmon. And that's it. That's our sample space. How many outcomes are there in this event? There are 6 different possible outcomes. And that's it. So guys, next, you are going to do a you try. I have given you a table this time, but I want you to use this table to see if you can come up with a tree diagram from it. So pause the video now, give it a try, and then come back and see if you figured it out. All right, so I hope you gave this a try and pause the video. We're going to start with the one that has the least amount of outcomes. So here the coin only had 2. Here the coin only has 2 as well. So I'm going to start and make my diagram like this. Oops, I want my pencil. 2 outcomes for the coin flip, and I'm going to write coin flip right here. So we know heads, tails. From my coin flip, I'm going to roll the die. There are 6 different numbers on the die, so I have to make 6 little lines off here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. What are the different numbers? I have to write them in. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Same thing has to happen on tails. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And we're going to label this here as the die. Okay, the next column, if you take a look up here, is the outcome. So we're going to write in the outcome. And that's where we write out the different opportunities. So notice here you don't have to write them with the brackets. You just have to write them out. And here it's totally fine to just abbreviate. So you can go heads 1, heads 2, heads 3, heads 4, heads 5, heads 6. And then underneath, or wherever you can find space, T1, T2, T3, T4, T5, T6. So it asked us to write out the sample space. So technically that means we have to write it the appropriate way with the brackets. Once again, I know it is kind of tedious, but you do have to show that. This right here is the tree diagram. The sample space is when we write out all of these outcomes with brackets. So I am going to go through and do that so you can see. I'm running out of space here, so I'm just going to go right down here. So heads 1. Bracket on either side and the comma in the center. heads 2. So you can go ahead and finish up this. Okay, so this right here, guys, is your sample space. Super important. Do not forget when you are putting this into your worksheets, bracket, comma, bracket, comma, bracket, comma, bracket, comma. Super, super important. So that was the little lesson for today, guys. It was a pretty short one, to be honest. So here's the textbook questions that you need to complete. Just disregard this part about the workbook. This is just when we were doing them on paper. Your workbook will be available digitally for you. It is so important that you watch this video, do the textbook questions, and then do the workbook, okay? Don't skip out any steps. It's important because I'm not there to help you. As I would be in the classroom. So I need you to make sure that you are following those steps in this order. Watch the video, do the textbook questions, check your answers in the back of your textbook so you know that you got them right, and then attempt the workbook. Awesome job today, you guys. Good work.